We effectively do not have a government at the moment. Teresa May has announced that she's leaving as Prime Minister because she's been so weak, and she doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons anyway. Her only big policy was Brexit. She spent 2.5 years negotiating her Brexit deal, which she concluded in October. She put it to Parliament. It lost by the largest majority. Any proposal from a government, major proposal from a government, has lost since the English Civil War in the 17th century, the majority of 230. So she was left without a policy. What she then tried to do is, and that was called a meaningful vote. It was the meaningful vote which under law she was required to have before she could sign this treaty into law. Well, what she then decided to do was to rewrite the Constitution and decided that votes that she lost were meaningless, and the only votes that are meaningful are the ones that she chooses to make meaningful, so i.e. ones that she wins become meaningful, ones that she loses become meaningless. So she had the second meaningful vote then, 6 weeks ago. She lost that by the fourth largest margin of any major government proposal since the English Civil War, so she declared that one to be meaningless too, immediately. She then had another interval, last Friday, in a very rare Friday sitting of the House of Commons. She had the third meaningful vote. She lost that by a majority of 58, which is a very, very large defeat in historic terms for a government. And as she's been losing these votes and her authority has been seeping away, as it has done, it also, of course, it's basically been seeping away since she became Prime Minister in July 2016, but when she lost her majority in the election and then all these votes, and then she had a leadership election as leader of the Conservative Party, which she only narrowly won, so her authority has been getting weaker and weaker. What's been happening is, of course, the crisis has been getting greater and greater, because not only is there no policy on Brexit, but meanwhile the clock has been ticking, because under the treaty arrangements whereby we negotiate to leave the European Union, once you give a notice, this thing called Article 50, a notice of your intention to withdraw, you have 2 years to negotiate and leave, which is the treaty that she's been negotiating. But if you don't either conclude a treaty or withdraw that notice within 2 years, you leave without any arrangements at all, which is, as the government told us last summer, because it published a whole lot of technical documents on what leaving would mean, would be catastrophic. 6 weeks of medical supplies, the great ports of the south and to France not working, the M20, the biggest car park in Europe, including all kinds of absurdities like, Mr. Grayling. Oh, by the way, it's Mr. Grayling's birthday today. It is his birthday. His birthday is April the 1st. When I saw the list of birthdays in the Times, I thought that must be an April Fool. But it is true. He was born on April the 1st, 1962, which means his whole life has been an April Fool. I now understand everything. He has been literally a living expression of the whole concept of the April Fool. But one of the very many manifestations of that was his negotiation and agreement with a ferry company that has no ferries to operate emergency ferry services. We left with no deal, which was supposed to be last Friday, and all of that. But all of that was the consequence of no deal. Parliament was getting extremely restive because there's a massive majority in Parliament against no deal and having some orderly Brexit. Parliament was getting increasingly restive as the Prime Minister's authority declined to vanishing point, and as her incapacity to develop a policy also declined. Parliament started taking charge in very, very unusual circumstances, because in our system of government, the Parliament and government are normally conjoined, because we have an election for House of Commons which then produces a government, and almost by definition the government has a majority in the House of Commons, so it wouldn't become the government. But in this unusual situation, where you had a hung Parliament plus a split Conservative Party, because the large part of the Conservative Party is not prepared to crash out of Europe on terrible terms, it's also split from the other extreme, because there are some that want to crash out on any term. So you've got an unholy alliance and just an impossible combination between them. As that happened, what Parliament started doing was taking charge. The great hero of this process is a guy called Dominic Grieve, who amazingly has been subject to what is essentially harassment and intimidation in his constituency in the Beaconsfield Conservative Association, which I would have thought was the epitome of genteel behaviour. If I had been asked before this process started, because Beaconsfield was Benjamin Disraeli's constituency, the founder of One Nation modern conservatism, if I'd been asked to define what would be the most genteel and polite institution in the country, besides the House of Lords, which is extremely genteel and polite, I would have said the Beaconsfield Conservative Association. But those of you who are journalists, It'd be worth going on Twitter and seeing, because somebody illicitly, there's a lot of illicit filming that takes place now, which is actually very interesting and revealing. There was illicit filming of the annual general meeting of the Beaconsfield Conservative Association last Friday, which is all over Twitter, which has people yelling who've just come into the Conservative Party recently, because it's been an infiltration, including the guy who was the UKIP candidate for Beaconsfield at the last election, who was leading the votes and the motions against Dominic Grieve in the Beaconsfield Conservative Association last Friday, with people shouting at Dominic Grieve as he was speaking like I'm speaking to you. Traitor, you fucking idiot. I mean, unbelievable things which have been happening, but which was filmed illicitly and is all over Twitter. That is the state of the public debate at the moment. But Dominic Grieve is an absolute hero of the Brexit process, because what he did early on, when it was clear that the thing was coming off the rails, is he got a whole lot of legal provisions in place as to what would happen in the end game if there wasn't a deal, which at the time, many people, including myself, thought was slightly over-egging it, because I didn't think we would really get to this extremity, but in fact is the salvation of the country at the moment, because all of the processes which are taking place at the moment were all of those established painstakingly by Dominic Grieve, as former Attorney General, an extremely capable lawyer, which he put in place and persuaded a majority of the House of Commons to vote for now more than a year ago, and they're all kicking in, and effectively they have become the Constitution. And one of them is what's happening today, which is in the event of the government not having any policy at all as we crash out of the European Union, then the House of Commons would itself hold what are called indicative votes, which are essentially expressions of view as to what Parliament wants, which it then would expect the government to follow. Now, we had one session of those indicative votes last Wednesday. There's one taking place today, where I think it's quite possible that some of the major proposals, including, I hope, a referendum, may get a majority. There'll be another on Wednesday, and that could work through to the right place. So where are we putting all this together at the moment? We're in the middle of a very great national crisis, which is part of the reason I assume why we're all here this evening. If people do sense that the ship of state is in a very bad way at the moment. It's like the Bellissima has already sort of sprung great leaks and holes, and it's already leaning over and could go the way of the Titanic if it's not careful. I mean, things are in a bad way, but we're not yet at the extremity, because from a combination of very good sense by our European partners, who've basically given us as much space as we need, plus the fact that the House of Commons has intervened essentially to stop the deal. We've had this first extension of the Article 50 negotiating period, so we didn't leave the European Union with no deal last Friday, as originally planned. The first extension will almost certainly lead to a longer extension, because almost certainly out of the mess that we're in at the moment, the government, whether it likes it or not, and Teresa May doesn't like it, but she will be obliged to apply for a long extension of the Article 50 negotiations while we decide what we're going to do. Now, what is it that will then happen in that long extension? It's not entirely clear, to be frank, what the course is going to be, but it will be, I think, one of two things. Either there will be a further negotiation over an alternative way of trying to leave, and there are a whole load of those: Norway, Customs Union, Canada +++, and you're all, of course, expert on all of them, so you know the pros and cons of them all. But it's possible that there could be a mandate out of these indicative votes to start negotiating those. They won't come to anything if there is a start, because it's not possible to put coalitions together that agree on these things. That's what we've seen from this current process. And also, they all have massive downsides to them, massive downsides. So just to take the Customs Union, which is being debated today, most of our trade with Europe isn't in physical goods, which is what customs controls deal with. Most of our trade now is in services, like, for example, the selling of education services. One of our biggest exports as a country, one of the things we are best at, is universities. We're in, you can see it, look at the facilities at Southampton, Solent, and the other Southampton University too. They're phenomenal. Roughly a third of the proceeds of universities at the moment come from overseas student fees. About a third of the staff, it'd be quite interesting to do a straw poll, but about a third of all academic staff, researchers and academic staff, come from the rest of the EU. This is a phenomenal European industry, but it's a service industry. And what matters to the ability of universities like this to keep going isn't actually trade in physical goods. It is the ability to sell services freely, for people to be able to move freely, for universities like this to hire overseas academics without having to go through laborious and difficult visa processes, all these things, which is all part of what's called the single market. So as soon as we get into a negotiation about the customs union, what will happen is people like me, who are trying to save the national interest and prevent the country being trashed, will say, aha, we don't like this at all, because this is only a very partial solution. What we need is to stay in both the customs union and the single market. So I will vote against any plan for a customs union, even if the government spends 15 months painstakingly negotiating and all that, because it's a terrible deal for the country. However, my good friends Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I spend more time in studios with than the members of my own family, because I'm debating Brexit the whole time, they will vote against it because it is too much Europe. They do not want a customs union or any agreement because they have phobias about the European Court of Justice that might start adjudicating on trade disputes, and. So they sit on the other side. So the same coalition which has essentially defeated Theresa May's deal 3 times now, possibly a 4th later this week, will be the same coalition that defeats almost any negotiation that there is coming forward. So it will be a fantasy negotiation if we have one. And where I think it will end up, but we might be able to short-circuit by getting there in one go, is towards a referendum, because increasingly it's clear that the only way you're going to be able to resolve this is either by giving the British people the opportunity actually to stay in the European Union, or them explicitly requiring the state to commit suicide. Now, states can do that. I mean, great civilizations have done that, Rome, Venice, and all of that. We could have a referendum where I think the choice would essentially be between staying in the European Union and leaving with some version of no deal. It is possible the British people will vote to do the no deal. Maybe the bus, again, with some slogan on the side, Farage out there, Boris, all of that. Maybe they will be able to win through a second time. I don't think so. Indeed, I'm fairly confident that they won't. But it's possible. But what I am sure of as a parliamentarian myself is that we absolutely shouldn't go down that course unless we have the explicit endorsement of the British people to do it, which is why I think we have to have a referendum and why I think there will ultimately be a parliamentary majority for it. So we're in a situation very similar to Sherlock Holmes in the Hound of the Baskervilles towards the end, where he says, Dr. Watson, after all the impossible solutions have been eliminated, you are just left with the improbable, which must be the truth. Well, we're eliminating the impossible ones. No deal, Theresa May's second deal, Theresa May's third deal, Canada plus, Norway, the customs union. All these are either have been eliminated or are being eliminated by Parliament at the moment, or will be eliminated once we go through the next phase of fantasy negotiations. Maybe we have to go through another traumatic year or longer to get there, but they are being. And then you are just left with the improbable, and the improbable is, I think, going to be the second referendum. Now, if we get it, and as I say, I think we will, but it could be a process of months before we do get it. The arguments for staying in now, it seems to me, are absolutely irrefutable if you believe that sovereignty is something to be shared for the national good and not something to be hoarded and never shared. And that's a straight ideological view. But there are many people whose view of life is entirely governed by theoretical notions of sovereignty. Most people, it's a pragmatic assessment of what you're using sovereignty for, which is what are you actually doing with this power that you've got at your disposal. And the reason why I think it's now open and shut is not only are the arguments always were strong for staying in Europe, but we've now got the experience of what's actually happened in the negotiations of the last 3 years. So we've got a combination of experience, which is generally the best guide to how people behave, particularly personal experience, and this is experience which we've all lived through the last 3 years, plus the arguments of principle. And that comes down now to 4 big arguments, each of which now has a big chunk of experience attached. And let me just run through those in the 7 minutes I've got left before the guillotine comes down. At 7:30 and I'll be speaking for 25 minutes. Big argument number 1, trade, jobs, the economy. We now know from all of the negotiations which have been conducted for the last 3 years that we cannot have our cake and eat it. We cannot have all of the benefits of being in the single market and the customs union by leaving the single market and the customs union, which is what we were promised 3 years ago. Do you remember Liam Fox, all those trade deals? Do you remember the ones that are all going to be ready for signature a minute after midnight when we leave, which was supposed to be a minute after midnight last Friday? None of them have been negotiated. None. Not a single one. Even the trade continuity deals for the existing trade arrangements we've got mostly haven't been signed. Of course, by definition, they haven't been signed with the EU, which is our largest trading partner, because Theresa May's deal has been rejected. But the EU itself, of which we are a part, has 53 other trade deals with 73 other countries. So far, the government has negotiated trade continuity agreements, which keep those going, with precisely 5. Precisely 5 of the 53, of which one of the most recent was the Faroe Islands, which I looked up, so I wasn't to know whether I found them on the map. I now understand they have a population of 50,000, which is half the population of the Isle of Wight. This is an absolute farce, and people can now see that it's a farce. They don't understand necessarily the plumbing underneath it. Those of you who studied economics know the first law of trade economics is that trade halves as distance doubles, which when you think about it, like almost everything which is academic, is actually common sense. Obviously you trade most with the people who live nearest to you when you think about it, which is the reason why we have most trade with our single largest trading partner is Ireland, because we're literally next door to Ireland, including a 250-mile border with 208 crossing points on the island of Ireland. It's a much larger trading partner than China, not because it's larger than China, but because it's closer and we're much more integrated with it. We now understand all these things. It is the reason why we have the customs union and single market. It's a good part of the reason why we're in the European Union and constructed it, because it is the partnership, including a big trade partnership and a free market, with the 27 other countries closest to us. And with the best will in the world, we are not going to be able to replicate the trade we have in Ireland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Greece, Portugal, France, and so on, with New Zealand, Australia, Antarctica, and the other places that Liam Fox wants to do. So the economic arguments are overwhelming. Argument 2, Ireland. We now know, because of everything that's happened, including this horrendous argument we've been having over this thing called the Irish backstop, we now know that if we leave the European Union, we will have a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which will breach the Good Friday Agreement and could lead to a breakdown in the peace process, unless what we actually do is to replicate arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which are tantamount to staying in the EU. Don't worry about all of the detail, because almost all complicated things can always be simplified. This thing called the backstop, which is 300 pages of the 580 pages of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, and is very technical at a plumbing level, the actual underlying principle is very straightforward. It is that to all intents and purposes, if Great Britain, which is most of the United Kingdom, leaves the EU and diverges seriously from the customs union and the single market, which is what the Brexiters want to do, including Teresa May, who wants to leave the customs union and the single market, in that eventuality, Northern Ireland will, to all intents and purposes, stay in the EU. That's what the backstop is. It's the reason why I like it so much, because effectively it means that at least one part is staying in the EU and we don't have a breach of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. But of course, why the Brexiters hate it so much, because it's the Trojan horse, keeping the whole of the United Kingdom in. Now, to be blunt, I have an answer to the problem of the backstop. You have an answer. Probably most of you who are pro-European have an answer to the problem of the Irish backstop. Just stay in the European Union. The whole horrendous experience of the last 3 years is you just don't need to go there. Those who want to leave have no answer to the Irish backstop except to pretend it doesn't exist, that somehow it'll all be in the cloud, that we'll have these frictionless border, even though there's no frictionless border in the world that has different customs arrangements and immigration rules, which are the two things that would happen if we leave the European Union. And so what they've had to resort to, which is Orwellian in its misuse of language, is because they have no alternative proposal to the backstop, but they want to pretend that we can leave the European Union and not have a hard border. They've started talking about these things called alternative arrangements. There's even an alternative arrangements working group, which is straight out of 1984 Animal Farm. I mean, that is wonderful, because the alternative arrangements working group has not yet identified any alternative arrangements. But what the Prime Minister keeps telling the House of Commons is we don't need to worry, because there are alternative arrangements, except there aren't. I mean, it is a massive Orwellian misuse of language. But what is the right policy? If we don't want to play fast and loose with the peace of Northern Ireland, and the best thing that's happened in the United Kingdom in the last 30 years, I think we almost all agree, is peace in Northern Ireland. We had a civil war raging in this country till then, with bombs going off on the mainland as well as in Ireland. Then the best thing to do is not to Brexit. Third big reason why we shouldn't Brexit is the next generation and young people. Now, many of us take advantage of the right to live, travel, work, settle and all that in the European Union. But for the younger generation, this is existential, because they're all starting to plan their careers, and they don't want to be shut up, as one of them put it to me. Actually, I think it was when I was at Peter Symonds College with Leo, who's there, who is running to be president of Peter Symonds College. Any of you have votes? He'll be canvassing you afterwards. He wants all your votes. But had a huge turnout of sixth formers at Peter Symonds College, which is one of the best colleges in the country. Overwhelmingly, they're in favour of two things. They want votes themselves. They want votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, and they're completely right about that. Because look what a mess the next generation above is making of their future. But they also want to stay in the EU. But one of them said, when I explained what would happen if we leave the EU, which is that their rights to live, work, travel and all that in the EU would be withdrawn. Because these are reciprocal rights. If we deny the rights of the Europeans to come here, our rights to go there will be withdrawn, which people are now understanding after 3 years of this debate. It's not just about immigration, which is people coming here. It's about migration, which is two-way. As they understood that, one of the students at the college said to me, Lord Adonis, I think I get it now. What you're saying is if we do this Brexit thing, we are going to be shut up on a small island with Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage. And they're right, they will be. We'll all be shut up on that small island as it happens. But for them, because they've got to survive on this island for longest, it's the worst possible future. And what's the right thing to do? Don't do it. Stay in the EU and don't trash the futures of young people. Fourth reason why we should stay in the EU, which again has become clearer and clearer over the last 3 years. The European Union is the best peace project in the history of Europe. Indeed, in many ways, it's the only peace project in the history of Europe. In the 2,000 years when this continent has sort of existed as a centre of population, and then colonised by the Romans, and then the Romans withdrew, and so on. That in that whole period, there have only been 70 consecutive years of peace ever between the major tribes as it was, and then the states as it now is, of Europe, being roughly the countries which correspond to England, France, and Germany. And those 70 years are the last 70 years, which are the only 70 years when there has been a club of democracies focused on security and prosperity, aka the European Union, in existence. And in the last 3 years, people have come not only to value that, but in the last 3 years, three big things have happened which concentrate people's minds. Trump has been elected. The President of Estonia, when I saw him recently, and Estonia is one of the newest member states of the European Union, desperately worried about its future with a big border with Russia and all of that. The President of Estonia said to me, when I wake up in the morning, I worry about two things every morning. One is Donald Trump, because I may be one tweet away from a Russian invasion. If Trump were to announce he's not standing by NATO, or something, it could easily happen. There are massive Russian troops on the borders of the Baltic states at the moment. So the second thing I worry about is Brexit, because you, Britain, are vital to the security of Europe. But there are only two military powers in Europe, us and France. So if we start withdrawing from the European mainland, and once we start withdrawing economically, we'll withdraw in security terms too, then the whole of European security becomes really, really vulnerable, particularly if America were to start playing fast and loose with the security of Europe. That's the first big problem we've got. The second is the re-elected Putin. The re-elected Putin, this is the guy who's already invaded one European country, Ukraine. He's occupied half of it, the Crimea. He's destabilising the other half. He has all these troops on the borders of these countries in the north of Europe, the small Baltic states. He's busy destabilising the Balkans at the moment, because Serbia, those of you who know your Balkan history and civilization will know that there's a large part which is Orthodox and looks to Russia, and there's a part which is Catholic and looks to West Europe. At the moment, that is the fault line between the EU and Russia at the moment. It's why Croatia is in the EU, but Serbia isn't in the EU and is looking to Russia. What is the right thing to do in response to these dangers? It's very, very simple. It's stay in the European Union and don't jeopardise our democracy. And in this great book, which I'm signing copies of afterwards, and all the proceeds go to great European causes, I cite the founding treaties of the European Union. And the really interesting thing about the founding treaties, which go back to this period where we started building peace and prosperity instead of war in Europe, because remember, the last 70 years have been the most peaceful in the history of Europe. The previous 70 years were the most violent. We have this idea that somehow civilization, which is a complete mistake, civilization is a linear movement from barbarism at some distant point in the past to civilization today. It doesn't in fact work like that. The period of biggest war and slaughter in Europe was the first part of the 20th century. The First World War and the Second World War were more barbarous, included more murder, warfare, death and slavery, including slavery, than at any time in the previous history of Europe. I remember when I studied history at university, the breakthrough in my understanding of how historical things work was reading a book on slavery, which charted the rise and fall of slavery, which isn't linear, it goes up and down between generations. In Europe, our continent, the peak year for slavery in the whole of European history was 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, when Hitler and his satellites, and, let's be frank, what was going on in Stalin's Russia as well, had enslaved not just large parts of their own people, but whole races and other peoples. Literally, either had them locked up or were under their direct control. And the whole construction of Europe was in reaction to that. Hence, the foundation of the European Union and the big treaties after the Second World War, which established what began as a club of 6 countries, headed by France and Germany, the big rapprochement between those two, and became just dealing with free trade in coal and steel, and then became the common market, and became the single market, and became the European Union as we know now, expanding from 6 countries in 1951 through to 28 countries today, from about whatever it was, 100 million to 500 million today. So it's been a phenomenal success. But the founding treaty was the Treaty of Paris of 1951, which was the first big treaty between France, Germany, and the other 4 countries in Italy, Benelux, and the Benelux states, that founded the original European institution. And the striking thing about it is it doesn't talk much about coal and steel. It doesn't even talk much about the economy. The opening paragraphs, which set out the objectives of this European project, are all to do with peace, war, civilization, and the avoidance of bloodshed. And I just want, in conclusion, to read it out, because this needs to be at the heart of our referendum campaign if we're fighting one this year as to why we should stay in Europe. The President of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Prince Royal of Belgium, the President of the French Republic, the President of the Italian Republic, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, the Queen of the Netherlands, considering that world peace can be safeguarded only by creative efforts commensurate with the dangers that threaten it, convinced that the contribution which a vital and organised Europe can make to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations, have decided to create a European coal and steel community. That's the reason why the European Union exists today. It's the reason why we're involved in this massive national argument about staying in it. It's the reason why I think the right thing for us to do is to have a referendum before we irrevocably commit to leaving. And it's the reason why I hope we'll all campaign till the last vote is cast to stay in. Thanks very much.